that's quite difficult to quantify in an objective fashion. You could use a government decision about this, but it's quite tough. Another thing is that, if New York City gets flooded, or if there's like whole civilizations that basically get wiped out because they're on islands that get submerged, how much value do we put on that? We probably put more than just the value of the lives and the property destroyed, because we have some inherent value for that civilization existing, but that's a hard thing to put a value on. Another thing is that, many farmers might know how easy it is for them to adjust to the climate change. And that might be really hard for outsiders to know because it depends on very local conditions. Similarly, there might be some inventors or innovators who know how easy it would be for them to come up with new technologies that will reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. And it might be impossible for the government to know that without asking those people. So all of these share the property that just science and expertise and external evaluation is not enough. We actually have to sort of ask people what they need. Okay, and this is true for a broad range of situations, actually. So anytime there is sort of subjective, what are called existence values, which are like, we don't want some culture to die off. We want some language to keep being spoken. We don't want the pelicans, to die, etc. We could either say, well, there's some expert who's in charge of figuring out how valuable that is, or we could get from individuals how much they're willing to pay to keep those things there. Or you could combine those. So it might be that people don't know that much about the pelicans in particular, but they have some sense of their overall value for environmental improvement, and you could combine that with an environmentalist sense of which things are most important to try to get a sense for it. Another thing is, if there's property that has a personal sentimental value to you, like something that was given to you by your grandmother or a house that's been in your family for generations, it's very hard from the outside to determine how much you value that property. You need to get from that individual what their personal value is. So you don't know how bad the externality that causes that house to be destroyed is until you figure out how much that person valued their house. Another issue is about local information about the impacts of a disaster or about technology. Entrepreneurs might know about how to mitigate climate change better. Farmers might know how badly his farm will be affected by things being very dry. A New Yorker might know how subject his place is to flood risk in a way that's harder to calculate from the outside. Though there's a question of how much of that stuff there really is, and people can debate about that, whether people really do have that local information, or at this point we can calculate using science things better than sort of anyone locally can do. Okay. So when this stuff really is important, and it's important that we get a sense of it to make real social decisions, it's going to become very important to find a way to get people to tell us this information that we need to make our decisions as a society. And it's important that this not just be an opinion or a guess, or that we not just say that, well, just because this person thinks this is worth this, that must be what it's worth. We actually have to think about the cases when it's really important, and they have really important information that in order to make any reasonable decision, we need to get a sense of. So, for example, in thinking about the inherent values of the survival of a culture or a civilization, we could either think about this in terms of how much society as a whole values this, and in which case it might be useful to just have some anthropologists think it through with a philosopher and not bother everybody about it. Or it might be, you might think that it really matters how much each of us individually values that society continuing to exist rather than just us as a society as a whole. And when we do need to get that information about how much each of us values something, one approach is we can just ask people. So this is a very traditional approach and has a very long history, and it's traditionally called contingent valuation, which is just a fancy word for surveys. So what you do is you go to people and you say, here's situation A, the pelicans are still alive. Here's situation B, pelicans are dead. how much would you be willing to pay to have Republicans alive? And then assume that this is what they're actually willing to pay, and then use that to make some public policy decision. So this is most commonly applied in environmental issues, but it's also used for transportation and for public goods and other situations. So, Udo, what are some examples of situations where contingent valuation has been used?
Used for how much it is worth to preserve something.
Yeah, so like a forest,
Yeah.
for example.
Yeah.
Preserving the visibility at the Grand Canyon. Preserving seals or whales in the ocean. Avoiding logging in national forests. Saving the birds that were killed by the Accident Valdez spill. Preserving the languages of indigenous cultures, building a new building that's beautiful in a city. So these are all real examples that have been done, and they tend to be commissioned, and there's many, many of these each year by regulatory agencies or courts. And these usually form part of a benefit cost analysis of regulatory action and externality, etc. And they are also used to assess the damages from various different things like an oil spill. And of course, those are just ways of assessing externalities, right? Because as we discussed in the last class, damages are exactly a way of internalizing externalities. So some of these surveys are, as I described, sort of formal and based on money. So we say, how much are you willing to pay for this versus this? But there's also less formal ones that are more just like surveys of the public saying, do you support the following thing or do you oppose it, etc. So in some sense you can see politicians relying on public opinion polls as being a bit like contingent valuation, but certainly a much simpler form of it. Right? Okay. So despite the fact that these could in principle be used for a lot of things, economists tend to be very skeptical of contingent valuation surveys. And Suraj, why do economists why are they not very sympathetic?
Because people might not really know how much they value these things when they're answering the surveys.
Yeah.
So there's not really a real incentive to give an honest answer.
Yeah.
Or give you like true value of how much these things are worth.
Yeah, so there's a bunch of reasons that, just like what Suraj was saying, is that one thing is, imagine someone came up to you with a clipboard and asked you some of these questions. Would you really take them seriously? Like, would you just be trying to get rid of them, basically? I mean, that's like how these things run. But, a second thing is that people might give their overall evaluation of how much this is worth to society, rather than the evaluation of how much to them personally it would hurt not to have the, seagulls in the Gulf of Mexico. And that's what we actually want to know, is how much it's worth to them personally so we can add it up across people, right? Another thing is that, as Suraj was saying, people might just have no idea what they're even sort of talking about, right? So, for example, if someone said to you, do you want to preserve the following forest? And they just gave some name. That could be referring to like the trees in some guy's backyard and you just gave it a name. Or it could be referring to like one of the most important like rainforests in the world, right? And like, how is anyone supposed to know what you're even talking about, right? So it doesn't seem very reasonable to like ask someone, would you like to, preserve this type of, whatever, unless the person has a pretty clear sense of what the heck you're even talking about, right? And more importantly, maybe people like have no experience with this sort of decision thing in their life. So like, if you ask me how much am I willing to pay to get like a really delicious fresh rather than like a Tropicana orange juice, that's a decision that I make every day, and I could give you a pretty good number. But like, if you ask me how much am I willing to pay to keep the, Hikoto language from like going extinct, whatever that is, I would be like, I have no idea. I don't even know if that's the language. You know what I mean? And like, it probably isn't, or maybe it is, because there's like 300,000 languages in the world that are like, you know, going extinct. So who knows? But I mean, it's like, how am I supposed to come to some sort of a judgment about that, right? And furthermore, people often answer these questions not based on like what they actually think or value, but on like what makes them feel good about themselves. Like a lot of people would feel really good if they said, oh, I'm willing to pay just like some enormous amount to save the environment because I'm such a good person. But they don't actually have to pay the money. So it's, you know. This is sort of borne out by the fact that if you ask people the same question in different ways, you get completely different answers. So if you ask people, how much would you be willing to pay to stop one historic building of 10 historic buildings in a town from being knocked down? You'll get one answer. You then say, how much would you be willing to pay to stop one historic building of 100 historic buildings in a state from being knocked down? You'll get a different answer. If you then say, how much would you be willing to pay to, one historic building of 1,000 in a country, you'll get a different answer. You know, just because it will all be relative to the number of things. So it's like, it's very hard to get a reasonable answer out of people on these things. Okay. So, things are actually even worse than this, which is that when people start, yeah, go ahead.
What about pay surveys? Do they like get more people to take the survey? Or pay surveys, so like they pay?
They definitely get more people to take the survey, but that doesn't mean people take it more seriously. Like I would be happy to take some money and then just like randomly answer the question. What the problem is, things get even worse when you start thinking about what are the incentives that people actually have. And this depends on what the survey is used for. So the survey might actually be used to make a public policy decision, or it might just be used for like me to have an example to give you in class, right? Now, what if no one takes seriously that the survey is going to actually be used for public policy? Xiaoling? What are people's incentives if nobody is really going to take the survey seriously? So if no one's really going to like make any decisions for society based on this survey that we're taking, what are the responses that people have an incentive to give?
You're not gonna.
Yeah, go. I think
They're
you're right.
not gonna really, like, you're not gonna take it seriously, I guess?
Yeah, I mean they just have exactly what we were talking about. They don't care. It's just like they have no incentives. They just say whatever they feel like saying. And in fact, unless someone's paying you, like why would you even take one of these surveys? Like people come up to you all the time trying to get you to take these surveys, and I'm like, you got to be kidding me. Like I'm going to spend 10 minutes here with you for some like completely pointless survey that like no one's really going to use for anything. So on the other hand, imagine that these are really serious, and there's going to be major public policy decisions made on the basis of this survey. Then, Isamar, what do you think the incentives of people would be?
Well, they would like pay people to take them or like offer them prices for it, I guess.
No, but what do you think people would have an incentive to respond in the survey? The question.
Oh. Well, they would have, if it's actually going to be used, they would actually want to answer it, so they would want to take part of it, so it'd be a larger incentive.
Well, Tejas, do you want to
Well,
follow
I
up?
was just wondering, so isn't voting then like a type of survey? Because you're trying to find like who's the best candidate?
Yeah, but there's an important difference. Well, I'll get to that in 1 minute once I finish this answer, but I'll tell you about that. Maria, did you have a?
Yeah, isn't it like it depends on where you stand on the issue?
Yeah.
Like if you have an incentive that it passes so that you save the animals, then you can save a bunch.
Yeah, so that's exactly right. So like, imagine that you're someone who really wants to see the environment saved. You might only be willing to pay $1,000, but that's more than it's going to cost you. Then you'll say, oh, it's worth $1 trillion to me, right, to get them to do it. On the other hand, if you don't want to see them saved, even if it's worth something to you, you'll say, oh, it's worth nothing to me, to try to get it not to happen, right? Vershawn?
But so how does that like solve the problem regardless of like people just answering questions randomly? Because like they might, the public policy issue might not be exactly relevant to them.
Well,